Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Ginia Bellafante. Thank you for joining us today. I am the big city columnist at the Times, and I am thrilled to be in conversation this afternoon with Reverend John Merz, an Episcopal priest based in Brooklyn, subject of one of my recent columns. And we are here today to talk about doing charitable work in times of crisis and the spiritual lessons that we can take for ourselves and for our loved ones as we navigate this incredibly difficult time in our lives. Today's event, I just want to point out, is part of a slate of virtual events that the Times is producing to help readers understand this crisis. Quick housekeeping note. You are invited to submit questions for us at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom. We will try to get to as many of your questions as we can, and please note that this event is being recorded on audio. John, thanks again for joining us from your home today. You are the founder, along with a partner, of a wonderful organization called the North Brooklyn Angels that you began several years ago with the goal to really resolve some of the tension and conflict and need that is bred by gentrification in Brooklyn, where a lot of people have been marginalized as the borough has grown more and more prosperous. And your idea was to have a mobile food bank go from neighborhood to neighborhood, volunteers coming from the Brooklyn neighborhoods you were serving, so people could really connect instead of merely look past one another. Tell me about the need right now that you have seen in this service you provide and what you are seeing on the ground in terms of what this crisis has wrought in hunger and poverty.
Oh yeah, thank you, Ginia. As you mentioned, we have this large blue vehicle, which we like to say is both an actual vehicle and a figurative vehicle for this work of connecting people. And my co-founder and I, Neil Sheehan, and he's really quite a wonderful and amazing community organizer in person, and came up with this idea as a way of addressing the fact that we have one neighborhood, and you could say it's gentrifying, or it's actually kind of in post-gentrification or late stage
right.
At this point. But how we could deal with the fact that we have two parallel communities. And that's one of the typical things that happens in gentrification is you have people that live in the same neighborhood, they don't go to the same bars, they don't go to the same restaurants, they don't belong to the same civic associations. So we wanted to bring neighbors together to help them recognize and get to know one another and also serve the need in the neighborhood. So we developed this large blue truck that goes to a different place in the neighborhood in North Brooklyn every day, serving need, using the neighbors in that section of the neighborhood that serve their neighbors. So we move around in that way, and we have a kitchen, etc. Now, of course, when this pandemic hit, obviously we have a mission that popped up out of this, which is the work we're doing with the Woodhull Hospital. But the actual day-to-day community meal service, now within the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen this go up 80%, 70 to 80% rise in meals desired and needed.
I mean, just to interrupt for a second, that's an astonishing number. I mean, when have you seen these I'm sure you've not seen an escalation like this in the entire time that you've done it. Obviously, the economy fluctuates and need fluctuates, but this is quite outstanding. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And actually, it's, the truck goes out, we go to a location, and it's not uncommon to 30 minutes later get a call back at the kitchen, we need more. And we've done sometimes 2 extra deliveries in the same day of just trying to get food to people who need. And it's everybody. I mean, people used to say it was a homeless soup kitchen, which it never was. I mean, we have wage workers that have always been coming out. But now it's really the full demographic is coming out.
And so you're seeing people who have been laid off, unemployed, probably people from the restaurant industry, right, which is big in Brooklyn, and who are asking and finding themselves in need for the first time in their lives, I'm sure, in many cases.
Absolutely.
John, I've got a question from a reader that pertains to what we're talking about a bit, from Jonathan. He asks, what do you think about small religious organizations applying for PPP funds to stay afloat, despite the fact that they might be part of a larger national organization?
Well, like for instance, I'm a part of the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island. And
Mm-hmm.
the easiest way for a layperson to understand that is, in a certain sense, it's like there's the brand and then there are the franchises.
Right.
And franchises, the local churches are actually most of the time self-supporting operations. Now we're all, one body in a certain sense, but in another sense, each congregation and local iteration of the organizational structure has to make it on its own. And I don't know, there seems to be this idea, I don't know how it came afloat, that the church or all of the churches have unlimited money.
Right.
Ask our roofers and our plumbers and go in and take a look at the condition of the building. We don't have unlimited money by any stretch. So
Right.
the
I mean, in the best of times.
yeah, the best of times probably for the church was about 6 or 7 years ago.
Right. Interesting. And what is your fundraising operation like right now? I mean, how are you getting the word out?
You mean as far as the church, or as far as the?
I'm sorry, for the meal service, since you're doing what, 60-70% more meals, right? Yeah.
So we have, for the hospital work, we established a GoFundMe, which we're getting a lot of traction on, but there's a lot of expenses there, and because we've rehired workers at Jimmy's restaurant in
Right.
Brooklyn in order to
Right.
make them whole, so that costs a bit more money. In terms of our finances for our regular operations, we've gotten some foundation money. We're getting some small donations. I mean, it's kind of like you'll have people that will just give $25.
Right.
We had somebody randomly drop $100 in a can as they were walking by the truck a few weeks
Wow.
back.
Right. Right.
So it comes from all kinds of sources. I mean, the generosity that people start appearing with is pretty astounding.
Good. That's good to hear. I want to shift to questions about faith and spirituality. I find, as I know that you do, so many people now, even those of us blessed with good health during this crisis, to be really experiencing a level of anxiety we're not accustomed to, even though we live in stressful times generally. At the same time, we're in this period in history of, commodified or pop spirituality, which plays out in, the whole sort of cult of wellness. I'm not seeing that really serve too many people all that well. What does traditional faith, how can traditional faith in spirituality really guide us through this right now?
Well, I think that what you might call McMindfulness, some have called.
Yeah.
Or American consumerist culture has a unique capacity to basically evacuate almost any the integrity of almost any religious tradition and turn it into some kind of a mode of self-help and a mode of creating the best you can be. It's really a cult of individualism, and you can see this in strands of American Christianity. You see it in strands of American Buddhism. You see it in all of this mindfulness movement. But the question always is, of mindfulness to what end? And so, I look at this and I think this is a profoundly spiritual time in a sense, because most people that come and want to have conversations about spirituality and being a member of the Episcopal Church, we're not a particularly prescriptive church. We see our role in many ways as kind of midwifing people's spiritual lives. And of course, we're Christian through and through, Orthodox in many profound senses, but it's the process of walking with people. And in this process, most people say when they talk about spirituality, I want to be involved with something bigger than myself. That's usually the first thing. Mm-hmm. And so in this particular instance, or something larger or greater than myself, and people feel right now powerless and out of joint. And I find it interesting because the reason I say this is a spiritual time is because the very word pandemic, the root of the word means pandemos, and that means pertaining to all. Right. We're all connected to something. The pandemos is something larger than all of us. and it's bigger than all of us, and it has an interconnection that is actually quite stunning, both from a physical standpoint, but also from a spiritual standpoint. And so there's an inherent spirituality in all of this. And then there are practices and processes you can enter into, like ritualized meditation, be it in the morning, having certain schedule you keep. But the goal of contemplation or the goal of prayer is always developing a more unitive and non-dual consciousness in relation to the energy that sustains all life, which some call God and others call, it might be the power behind the Dharma or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
But there is this energy and this vitality in which we want to connect to that larger thing. And there's an obligation and a responsibility in this. It's not about sanitizing or disinfecting, to keep in the spirit of the pandemic, the spiritual life, so it becomes something that's mine, to make my life better, so I can exit the turmoil and rise above it. That's a natural American spiritual tendency. It's actually called traditionally Gnosticism, moving outside of the body. But
relevant question here from a listener speaking to this question of our connectedness and how we can facilitate it. Sarah asks, what can we do besides donating money right now to help others? And it's a great question, because we're all inundated with, these GoFundMe requests, and there's need everywhere, right? You could spend your whole day generating $5, $10, $20 donations out of just from what comes into your inbox. But, people often want to do more than that. What are your suggestions on that front?
Well, I remember when the pandemic was just landing, and I spoke to the woman who runs my child's nursery school. I think at first it seemed a little bit of an odd thing to say, but I was saying before we left the last day, I said, let's be in contact, because you're a community leader. You have a list, you have a network, and there may be ways in which we're going to have to connect. And what I would say is one of the things we're doing now with the North Brooklyn Angels is we're moving into dealing with trying to connect with the senior population in the neighborhood. How can we feed? How can we deal with medication? How can we think about maybe and eventually library books or whatever people need? Everybody lives on a block, this is kind of like, not to be too literary, but like at the beginning of James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, when the telescope goes out from the block all the way out to the universe. I mean, everybody has this tiny postage stamp space they live in. Check on your neighbors, walk up and down the block and find out if you live in a building, print something out, slip it under everybody's door. If you need, let us know, call me. If you have that kind of bandwidth. Now, everybody can't do that, but even those kinds of little things help people know they're not being forgotten, that they're caught in a network and a web that will not let them become invisible.
And John, I think another issue for people is they're caught between, a true desire for charity and then their own fear. Well, if I go, I don't want to go into that apartment building and touch those elevator buttons or whatever. I mean, how do we, it's hard to come to terms with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's probably, I think this calls for a lot of creativity to think about it. And I'm not ultimately, I was a college chaplain, and sometimes the students would come to me and I'd say, look, I'm not the shell answer man, I mean, I think you have to look you have to look very closely at the connections you have with people.
Yeah.
And the skills that you have that you may not even know you have. And think about, if you really have a desire to help outside of money, how you can use those skills.
Right.
And the abilities you have, or the abilities you have that others don't have, to reach out and affect and have some kind of an effect.
Right. I mean, it's true. I mean, some people might, not know how to use all of this new technology, for instance, that we're also dependent on now. I mean, that is one way to help,
Yeah, I have a parishioner who's just done that recently, who went to a 98-year-old woman's house and got her something called a gram pad, which I've never heard of, and
Yeah.
helped her get hooked up to, the virtual world.
Right.
Probably,
And speak to her family. Exactly.
yeah.
We have a question now from Jennifer, who is a priest in Boston. And Jennifer asks, could you speak more about the underlying justice work that is being revealed through the need for increased charitable work for our most vulnerable brothers and sisters?
Well, I mean, look, we saw this in Sandy, and it's getting a little bit, I'm 54 years old, and I guess I hope I don't have to go through this 3 more times before I check out of this grand narrative. But, we saw this in Sandy when the water receded. We're seeing this now that, we have all this talk of pre-existing conditions and underlying conditions and vulnerability.
Right.
But you have this in the body politic. And there are all kinds of underlying conditions. I mean, if you go out to Sunset Park, my friend is running something called the Brooklyn Immigrant Community Support Network.
Mm-hmm.
The Latino community, you have whole buildings there that are infected.
Right.
You have people that are, because of the climate we've created, people are preferring to die in their buildings than even go to the hospital because of what's going on, because of the legacy of the xenophobia and the vilification of people. So, and the Black community is also dying at twice the rate. Now, there has to be at some point some kind of public advocacy and recognition, because the spiritual moment, what they call in spirituality a kairos moment, where eternity kind of takes hold, is where you can finally see, the kairos moment is where you can see God and God can see you, where you can see your neighbor, and your neighbor
clarity.
can see
I mean, it's clarity. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. The opposite of certainty.
The opposite of certainty. Right. Which
certainty are very different.
There's no certainty right now.
Yeah.
John, you and I have talked about a piece of art from a 16th century German painter called the Ischenheim altarpiece, which is very meaningful to you and which you feel is very resonant to the moment. And I'd love to cue it up so our listeners can see it. Tell me why you find this piece so resonant right now.
Well, this altarpiece, and I've been meditating on this for probably 25 years, and was created by Matthias Grunewald in 1512. There was a plague going on in that corner of Germany, France, and it was a plague of infected barley, and it created a disease called ergotism. Actually, many at the time thought it was syphilis, and so this altarpiece, which is actually where the sacrament of the communion would have been celebrated, was painted by Matthias Grunewald. And if we were capable of doing this, and I suggest that the listeners actually Google it and go look at it, if we could zoom in on the body, we would see some quite stunning things. But I want to frame this a little bit in that the disease caused hallucinations. It caused crawling skin, incessant itching, fissures of pus. I mean, absolutely brutal.
Horrific, right?
Like death. And on the left side of the altar, you'll see the famous figure, the left on your computer, of Saint Sebastian with his little piercing there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Saint Sebastian was prayed to as the one we prayed to for prayer, the prayer of prevention from the plague and the disease. And on the right side, you'll see Saint Anthony, who the hospital was named after, and it was the prayer for the miraculous cure. So this is very relevant to today because you have Sebastian ought to have a P95 on, praying for prevention. He doesn't want to get this disease.
Right.
And Saint Anthony is the prayer once you have it for the miraculous cure. But the centerpiece of the altar is is absolutely grotesque if you can see it up close. The feet are turning green and they look like dragons' feet.
Yes,
The
yes.
hands are reaching up, with almost saying, "Why have you forsaken me?" And if you come close into the wounds on the body, doctors have validated, you can see prick, that he is suffering from exactly the exact disease that the patients in the St. Anthony Issenheim Hospital and Chapel would have been suffering from. And every day they used to drag the patients before this broken and devastated and infected body of Jesus in a Christian culture. And what they would have looked up and seen hallucinating was the image of their God figure suffering exactly as they suffer. And they probably would have, because they were hallucinating, got confused. And of course, in the sacramental nature of the altar, there's things where you hear, "This is my body given for you. This is my blood given for you." And they probably would have started thinking, who is here suffering? Is it me? Is it God? And so there was a conflation. And the importance of this image is because this is the Orthodox image of the reality of the Christ image that was always existing in the church, of the idea of God with humanity. This is not a rescuing figure. This is not a deus ex machina. This is not the American Christian success story. This is solidarity, closeness. You want to get back to what the other person said. This is Jesus in the American story on the lynching tree. You know, this is Jesus in the building down in Sunset Park. And the question becomes, how are we going to see the divinity in the suffering and actually begin to address it? You know, my hope in all this, moving through this, is we might, for once, and I'm naive in believing this, develop something called a spirituality of citizenship that would be rooted in the common good, that would express just living as something that works for all, not just me or the advantage. And this is not McMindfulness that you're looking at right here.
Right.
This is Mick participation. This is Mick involvement. You know, to steal something from Coke, maybe this is the real thing. You know, so I love this image. And if we could get to the there is a resurrection image, which looks incredibly like.
Yes.
We don't have it, I don't think, but it looks like an Indian painting of Nataraja, who's a form of Shiva. Jesus is basically dancing in an aura, this divine dancer of life. And of course, the Shiva images, God is both giver of life and taker of life, destroyer and giver. This does not jive in any way with the Jesus who fattens your bank account.
Right.
And who keeps life clean and disinfected. But so be it.
I want to talk about some of the mythologies we create around people who do such good work right now. The hero, that's our default descriptive for anyone who is on the front lines, you know, first responders, people like you, all the healthcare aides, and it is meant to be laudatory, and yet there is a sort of short shrift element to it, right? Because we just knock it off with one word. What is your feeling? What does that language, and who does that language serve?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things we have to always be careful about is the way in which we use language and what it really signifies. Now, it's clear that the people that are working on the front line, and I've been reading the stories in the paper and encountering some of the folks when we deliver food, there is a tremendously self-forgetting service that they're doing. And that's, to me, a definition of a hero, is somebody who self-forgets, especially in gift to others. And you know, that is what people are doing. But I think at the same time, we have to be careful, because when we say that, the people who are doing this work are complicated, emotionally, layered human beings, and they're going in there and they're facing, and they're probably faced with all kinds of ambivalences. And I think that
and again, fear. I mean,
and
naturally
fear
fear.
as well, fear as well. And I think, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a chaplain at Mount Sinai Hospital this morning,
Yes.
and he said, there are people who have come out of war and they're thanked for their service, and it's very hard for them because they're actually just making eggs in the bottom of the ship. And
Yeah.
and he said it's probably better, and this is a guy who's in the hospital every day, to say, hey, whatever you're doing and however you're doing it, I appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing, because there's room there for the ambiguity and the mixed nature of feelings people have. And there's also something strange about, for me, of calling people heroes. I wonder now, and as I said, I want to be careful, because they are heroes and it's heroic work. But at the same time, when you under-equip people and you don't give them the tools they need, and there's all kinds of problems around that, I think you have to be careful with that, just how you leave that out there with people. I think you have to have a more nuanced way of showing your appreciation, but it's hard. It's hard for people because you do. It's a tremendous work.
I mean, what do you think of the nightly clapping in New York City for those?
I like it. I think it's very inspiring, and it's great for the kids to hear. And I personally think it's a new form of the church bells ringing.
You do? Interesting, right.
So I think there's something to it. I mean, I've heard complaining about it, but people are trying to find ways to celebrate and be involved, and that's also, it's its own form of, people are isolated in their homes, so you can think of it as a kind of a form of a smoke signal too,
Yes.
standing out front and making noise.
To touch back on something you just said, I mean, in terms of the person, the hospital worker who doesn't feel as though, they deserve all this. Many of us, I think, are subject to guilt that we're not doing enough. I mean, what do we do with that guilt? It is not, it isn't, it's never productive, but I think it's when you see so much disparity in the way this is being experienced, and how much people are suffering, it's easy to sort of become paralyzed by your guilt and do nothing, because you feel that you are fortunate for your health, for your, for your home, for your material possessions.
Well,
I mean, yeah.
I would say, returning back to the idea of a new spirituality of citizenship rooted in the common good, that this event is an event. It's what is happening, and everybody has to do the things that they've been called upon to do, that they choose to do. But we have to develop some capacity to have a resolve for people to commit to. This is not a discrete, this is revealing things about our society and about human interconnection that we need to attend to. So there may be ways right now where people are going to be limited and isolated in ways that they can help. But this is good. But the things that are being revealed are not things that we can fix on GoFundMe. And they're not things we can fix simply through delivering something simply. These are structural issues that it's our responsibility as a society that is really, for us and by us in terms of governing, that we need to take a hold of.
Let me ask you, in terms of what you're seeing with North Brooklyn Angels, are you seeing a kind and level of heightened volunteerism that you believe will keep people engaged when we pass this crisis? I mean, or are you seeing people, are there newcomers kind of showing up and saying, I'm going to do this and possibly stick with this kind of missionary work past this?
I absolutely think so. I was just in the kitchen yesterday, and Neil Sheehan and I were sitting. We were actually reading a letter, I should say, by some parents of a young girl in the neighborhood who had written us and said she was foregoing her birthday celebration and money and wanted us to have the money to do some good, which was stunning. that a young person would do this, donate their birthday gift to this work. And while we were talking about it, I was looking around, and you have these little moments, given the fact that we began to talk about this in a Dunkin' Donuts and 5 years ago, and people, when we brought it up to people, I sometimes felt like it was Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And I looked around the room, and there's 25 people, and there's music playing, and there's energy, and there's purpose, and there's joy, and commitment, and care. And I just had a moment where I just was so stunned. And Neil was saying to me last night, because we check in like 15 times a day,
Right.
that our work now is, we don't work as much in the business as we work on the business. We come, we check in, we look at this end, we do this and that, we make connections and networks. But the people have owned this in such a profound way that it's stunning, and it's amazing to see. And there's so many different levels in which people are participating. And I think everybody who's been involved with us for a long time just feels so thankful for everybody's love and commitment and effort. So I get a little choked up even thinking about it, because
Sure.
it's so amazing to see, and to be allowed to participate in.
And can you just tell us, it's a lovely anecdote, just how you and Neil met, your partner in this incredible venture, because it tells us a lot about how we can connect to people, how cities allow us to connect to strangers in the most serendipitous ways.
Yeah, Neil and I used to have a giant Bernese Mountain Dog, Lola, who's now not this any longer. And I was walking down the street, and I bumped into Neil. He knew I was the new clergy person over at this church. And, I'm somebody who talks to folks on the street, and Neil was. And so we walked and talked. Actually, I think Neil was jogging, but he jogged so slow that I was walking with my dog and he was jogging. And we just walked for a while and talked and started talking about community stuff. And since that time, we started a separate soup kitchen. We started a homeless bed shelter together. And the fun of it too is it's all kind of theologically rooted, although from the outside, we're not like proselytizing anything. It's just where we come from. This idea of bringing human beings together to become more human and humane, and access a sense of purpose and care for one another.
Right. I want to throw another question at you from another fellow clergy person, Eva, an Episcopal priest, who asks, how do you advise church leaders who have had to shut down feeding programs on how they might reopen? And how does it pertain, and how all this pertains to figuring out how the needs have changed while we were closed? She mentions homeless people who you can't just call or email. And there might be new people you want to connect to and have really no means of getting to them.
Well, that's that's a hard question for me to answer, because it's so particular as to where a soup kitchen is located,
Mm-hmm.
What they were doing. But I mean, you open up the doors and you start to cook some meals, and you do it in a safe manner. Take that very, very seriously. If you don't take that seriously, you shouldn't do it the way in which you do it. Naturally, sometimes you'll have slips, but on a general level, you have to have that kind of seriousness. And then in terms of finding people, listen, the hunger is going to start, you might as well keep the pilot light lit and think about how you're going to do it, because we're going to see some kind of hunger in the next year and a half that we haven't seen before. And in terms of finding homeless folks, in New York, I don't know where she is, but in New York City, like I'll say, like, I know Neil just keeps extra meals in his car, and he'll stop off at the Key Food on his way home and find the guys who are doing the cans and just give them food. I mean,
Incredible.
The people.
I think, yes, for listeners who don't live in New York, we were at record levels of homelessness before this crisis.
Yeah.
And, everyone is really preparing for what this is going to look like going forward, as certainly thousands and thousands of more people will be sent into homelessness from this. There's the whole, housing crisis. Again, we were really struggling with, that is all of these things will be made worse. I want to ask you a question from a listener named Frank, who asks, what are some lasting ramifications regarding donations generally and charity from this pandemic? For instance, clothing donations have stopped in some places. I mean, might be a fear of contaminated material that, and there's this need, and then will there be some difficulty in making certain kinds of donations?
Yeah, I guess that's going to have to be, that'll have to be determined what the need is, what needs people have. And then, everything is contextual. Like, you have to find out in any given moment, what are the needs? If you find out the needs, are there particular ways those needs have to be met? Whether things need to be cleaned in a certain way, or, just all of this is evolving. I mean, I would equate it more to surfing. Like, you don't set out and say, you got to see what the wave looks like. And of course, I can't even swim, by the way, but but I can imagine what surfing would be like. I mean, you just got to get on the wave, and you can't talk about the wave from the shore. You just get on it, and then get your balance, and then start figuring out the needs. And you'll probably fail, but failing is okay. And then get back on and keep going.
Right. A listener named Mary asks that you speak in a bit more detail about the plight of immigrants. She says, besides the ordinary daily basic needs that those in poverty struggle to resolve, immigrants obviously face a deeper plight. Are there specific things we can do to help those people?
Well, I mean, there's outside of this pandemic, or
I think she means in this pandemic. As you say, people are, you were talking about the situation in Sunset Park, right? I mean,
well, I would say, like, I can say, for instance, with that group, the Brooklyn Immigrant Community Support, which I will plug, has a GoFundMe. Like, their need right now is desperate need of food, much more so than certain other more connected communities in terms of being connected into influence into City Hall or other places. And so I think finding out groups, responsible groups that seem really like they're doing the right thing, finding them and then donating to them is a big deal, and I think that outside of that, it all becomes a question of commitment. There are plenty of groups here in New York doing ongoing work, New Sanctuary Coalition, other groups that are doing all kinds of work in immigrant communities. And the best thing to do is probably, as this thing changes, go and attend meetings quietly and learn.
Right. And you raise another interesting point, for the civilian who's new to this world, of charity, and with so many organizations, many of them small, how do you are making, what is the best way, just as a matter of strategy, to make sure the organization is doing the kind of work they say they're doing? I mean, I'm not implying that there's tons of fraud out there, but I
think it's a matter of due diligence. I mean, I think you look online and I always, whenever I go online and look at something, I look at the board, I look at the descriptions of what they do.
The board members, the trustees, who's on the board. Yeah.
I look at the staff, I look at the track record, you can find all kinds of things online, there might be some community comments, call somebody up from there, visit if possible. I mean, even in this context of social distancing, I mean, maybe I'm out of my mind, but I do leave my house. I have goggles, I have gloves, I have a mask. You can still have some level of proximity within 10 feet of people, 10 feet if you want to be safe, I wanted to mention something, but unless it's a problem. It relates to the earlier question of a spirituality and how you can orient yourself.
Yes.
And it relates to the question of whether people get up and meditate and they pray or they sit in Buddhism or whatever they may do, contemplative prayer. And, I began this thing and I said to myself, wow, I have all this time now. I'm going to read uh, that giant book. I mean, I have so many books I haven't read. And so I said, well, I'll take my evenings and I'll do this. And of course, 3 Zoom calls and I'm completely
Wiped
devastated.
out. Right. Right. Nobody's learning Latin right now, even if they
Yeah,
want to.
exactly. But on another level, and I was talking to my friend who's a chaplain at Mount Sinai, and he said, I can't read. I'm trying to read a novel, and I can't. And it dawned on me that a spiritual practice, and it's kind of personification that might not be bad, is I think the reason we're unable to concentrate and we're out of joint is because what's been activated in us is the and the fight or flight instinct and the reptilian brain. And essentially, we're like buzzing all the time with this kind of distracted energy. And I've developed a little thing where I basically recognize in a different way. I'll say to it, like directly, I know you're protecting me, and I know you're shrouding me, and you're taking care of me, because this energy is letting you know that there's some danger in the air, and there is danger. And so it's actually our native structure that's actually doing something very kind and very generous. The problem is that it doesn't shut off.
Right.
And that's
Absolutely.
very bad for the immune system, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, I think actually addressing it and saying, look, let me take your reptilian paw, hold in my hand, and say, I thank you, I appreciate you, but I need you to settle down now. Go back, go away, and actually recognizing it. And it involves that Isenheim picture too. It goes back to that, not shying away from these, that's almost like a demon picture,
Yes.
with the sickness and the disease being inhabiting the Godhead, in the same way of saying this fear structure that's in us is a blessing, and we have to befriend it in some way and just ask it to give us a little rest.
John, that is a wonderful and beautiful and practical way to come to the conclusion of our discussion. And I want to thank you so much for your time, especially with all that you've got going on and all that you're doing. I want to just say that this event is part of an ongoing virtual conversation series with Times journalists that takes place every day. Tomorrow at 5, you can join John Caramonica, our music critic, and Joanna Nikes, writer and editor for Styles, for a happy hour all about how does a New Yorker talk. That sounds like a lot of fun. Find out more about our full slate of digital events at thenewyorktimes.com. And thank you so much for joining us, listeners, subscribers, and we wish you the best. Come back soon. Bye-bye.